All right, so I'm kicked back in my recliner with the dog in my lap, doing some notes here with you today, and so hopefully you're more comfortable than you would be in the classroom as well as we run through the rest of the material for our kind of biochemistry and nutrition unit. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about proteins, we're going to talk about lipids, and then we're going to talk a little bit more just in general about nutrition. So if we start with protein, protein is a biochemical structure made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, as well as nitrogen, and sometimes there's a little bit of sulfur in there. And while probably the most important function in your body for protein is as enzymes, they also are your primary structural component. So basically, most of what you are made of is a lot of protein. All your muscle is protein, your hair is entirely protein, your nails are entirely protein, and then you've got all these connective tissues kind of holding you together, and they're all made of protein as well. Proteins also serve as messengers and receptors, so they're important in cell communication through your body. And you also have a bunch of proteins that are made as part of your immune response in your body, so they help you fight off diseases. But proteins are fairly complex in their structure. Other words or other terms for protein include peptide and polypeptide. But ultimately, all of these things are made up of amino acids. And amino acids have a very, like a sort of a common structure. They have a central carbon surrounded by four things. They've got a hydrogen on one side, they've got an amino group on one side, they've got a carboxylic acid group on one side, and then they've got a side that varies, a variable group. So this is why we call them amino acids, because they have an amino and an acid functional group on them. The way this works is that amino acids are joined together to form a larger protein, and you can really see proteins that are hundreds upon hundreds of amino acids in size. So these building blocks come together, and the way these building blocks come together is a anabolic or an anabolic reaction, right? That we call dehydration synthesis, where we put together these two molecules by removing this H2O. Now, what this forms is called a peptide bond between each amino acid and the next amino acid. There's 20 different amino acids, so 20 different building blocks to choose from in nature. 12 of these your body can actually make throughout your life. The other 8 you cannot make, however, and so we call those the essential amino acids because they are essential in your diet. Right, so this is, just as it says here, one of the many reasons why it's really important that you do have some protein in your diet. So here's a list of the essential amino acids versus the non-essential amino acids. So again, these are the 8 that you have to get in your diet. These 12 you can actually make. Now, I will expect that you could recognize the essential versus the non-essential amino acids. So when it comes to test time, you're going to have to spend a little bit of time with this slide because I would expect that you could recognize these 8 as being essential in your diet. Secondly, I would expect that you could recognize the 3-letter abbreviation for each of these. Notice for the most part, they are just the first 3 letters, but that doesn't always work. So for instance, isoleucine isn't just iso, it's ILE. And tryptophan isn't tri, it's TRP. And then you have some other ones too where there's a couple different ones that would start ASP. So ASP is aspartic acid while ASN is asparagine. So just a couple things to study here then. Which ones are essential, which ones are non-essential, and how do we abbreviate each of these amino acid names? And the reality is we're going to keep seeing these amino acids this year as we move through the year because they are so important to the body. Now when it comes to protein, don't get too caught up in this picture because it's a little bit complicated, but the most important thing for me is that you realize that shape is so important. All right, remember, since the very beginning of the year, structure and function go together. So in order for a protein to do its job, whether that's as an enzyme or as a structural component of your body, that protein has to have the right shape. So what we talk about are 4 levels of structure in proteins. We've got primary, secondary, tertiary, and quaternary. Essentially what it comes down to, though, is this note right here. All right, the sequence of amino acids, which is what your primary structure is, leads to a particular 3-dimensional shape. So we get some folding here that's kind of a little bit more 2D, and then we get more folding so that it becomes somewhat 3D. And a protein's 3D shape determines its function. So basically, whatever the sequence of amino acids is leads to a particular shape, and that shape determines what a protein can do. Now, if you notice, quaternary structure just means that we've added proteins together. So this is several proteins combining to form a particular structure. So not every protein even has quaternary structure. But the main point is, eventually we get to this 3D shape, and that determines what our function will be. All right, so moving on to lipids. Proteins are super important. We're going to keep seeing proteins this year, but don't really necessarily have a real good clinical example for us at this point for just proteins in general. So we'll talk about that more later as we move on. Now, lipids. I don't know if you guys, you're probably not old enough to remember Fats Domino, who's an old singer, early rock and roll kind of guy, but lipids are the fats and oils, and these structurally are just big groups of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Lipids are really carbon rich. So what we say is that lipids have much more carbon than anything else, really, much more carbon than oxygen. Generally, something like a carbohydrate or a protein has pretty similar numbers of carbons and oxygens, but lipids will have a whole lot more carbon in these big chains usually. So lipids are essential for a few reasons, and even though we're sort of trained by society to think of fat as bad in our diet, you do need some fat and you need some lipids. To be totally healthy, you need to have some fat on your body for long-term kind of like backup energy storage. We also need particular lipids for other functions like our membranes. Right? Remember, the membrane is made primarily of phospholipids, so we have to have fats for that. And when you look at a lipid in the diet, it usually has a structure kind of like here on the lower right, which is called a triglyceride. A triglyceride has a little glycerol backbone with these chains called fatty acid chains attached to it. And hence, triglyceride, we usually have 3 of these fatty acid chains attached to our backbone. Now, when you talk lipids, there's a terminology that I know you've heard of before, which is saturation, that comes up a lot. And the saturation really determines sort of the structure and also how, kind of what the fat will do. So first we've got saturated fats, which are pictured up at the top of this image here on the right. Saturated fats are fats where all the carbons are joined by only single bonds, which means that these carbons are in single file and they make a nice rigid straight line structure like you can see in this picture. Now what that means is that these fatty molecules can basically stack on each other really nicely, and it leaves us with something that is more solid at room temperature. So best examples of saturated fats are things like butter or lard, or animal fats. If you think about like bacon fat, right? We're talking about something that's pretty solid at room temperature. And I know you guys are familiar with what butter is, but lard is another kind of animal fat cooking substance that's just kind of has that same kind of solid, greasy, solid texture. I love this picture, this real advertisement from who knows when, a long time ago, where basically the food industry was trying to get people to use lard more often, and so they show us these beautiful people and they all eat lard, which just sounds weird. And today you rarely see that because we know, as we'll talk about in a minute, lard is not very good for you. It has a tendency to kind of stick to your blood vessels a little bit. So that's saturated. Now, the unsaturated fats are a little bit different. Right, so the unsaturated fats, like the bottom part of this picture here, they are unsaturated, meaning that their carbons are not saturated or not fully covered with hydrogen. Now, the reason that the carbon is not fully saturated with hydrogen is because some of the carbons are connected by double bonds, like these two in the picture right here. Now, what this does is it causes the molecule to bend, or we usually say it kinks, right? And when you try to stack these bent molecules, they don't stack up nicely at that molecular level. So, at the larger level, what this means is that this lipid, instead of being solid at room temperature, is liquid at room temperature. And so, we have our oils, right? Canola oil and vegetable oil, I think, are most common to cook with. Olive oil is much, very popular right now as well. But any kind of oil you hear of would be an unsaturated fat example. Now, a couple kind of practical applications and then a clinical application when it comes to lipids. The first one is trans fats. You've probably heard of this. Trans fat is a big kind of buzzword right now in the food industry. Lots and lots and lots of restaurants or food producers, like this little snapshot of the Dorito bag here, are advertising that they're trans fat free, or they have no trans fats in their product. And you might kind of wonder why. Why are they bringing this up? Well, trans fats are a type of unsaturated fat. All right, so catch that it is not saturated, right? That is particularly bad for you. And the reality is that trans fats are not naturally occurring. Trans fats are created when an industry attempts to modify a fat. Now, most likely before, you have probably seen this term, partially hydrogenated oil. If you haven't, check out some food packages, some labels sometimes with contents, and you're going to see this partially hydrogenated oil. What this means is they've taken oil and they've added some hydrogen to it. Now, why would they do that? Well, here's what it does. Right? So if we follow down here to this picture, right, we take oil and we start adding hydrogen to it, we're going to be able to somewhat solidify it at room temperature. And this might be useful for cooking, production, maybe even shipping of this around the country. So what a food company or corporation might do, or a restaurant might do, is to use some of these partially hydrogenated fats in their production, right? Because it's going to be easier to mass produce that way. So check out what you end up with. Right? If you hydrogenate some oil, you can form different types of margarine or shortening. And if you guys have ever baked before things, you may be familiar with shortening or margarine. These are artificial lipids. They are a lipid. They come from an oil originally, but they don't occur in nature like something like lard does, right? Or bacon fat. This is a fat that we've created, so to speak, as a solid. Now, the next question is, okay, so why is that so bad for you? Well, lipids can come in one of two shapes as a whole. And so now, let's see, let me get a different color. We're looking at this picture here. So if a lipid, and this actually applies to a lot of things in chemistry, it's not just fats even, but if a lipid has more of this sort of straight configuration, we call it a cis lipid. And if it has sort of this bent configuration, we call it a trans lipid. Now, the enzyme that you have that breaks down lipids is called lipase, and lipase is cis-specific, meaning the only thing that lipase can actually break down are these cis fats. If you happen to ingest some of these trans fats, hence the name, right, what happens is they don't get broken down. It's very difficult for your enzymes and then therefore for your digestive system to get rid of these or break them down. So what happens is they end up getting stored long term. So the FDA came out about 5-6 years ago, I think, and released a statement saying that trans fats have no benefit for us, but are harmful. They only lead to fat gain. So, right on top of the high fructose corn syrup that we mentioned previously in class, this is another thing that has kind of been blamed for the obesity epidemic in the United States. And so you're seeing more and more places, like fast food restaurants and things, that are using true oils and not using any kind of trans fats now when they fry foods and things like that. Now, the second practical application I don't have quite as much to say about, but just kind of like amino acids, there are also some essential fatty acids that you need, meaning that your body can't create them, and so you have to consume them in your diet. And so you may have potentially heard of omega-3 fatty acids before. These are a type of unsaturated fat. So again, this is a type of oil that you would see in nature that you do want to have in your diet because these are beneficial fats. The most common two types of omega-3s are called EPA and DHA. You don't have to worry about what that stands for, but these are found naturally in fish. So you may have even heard before of, usually older people probably, but individuals taking fish oil as a little supplement, even like a little pill sort of thing. And this is what they would have in there. So this is why it's really good to occasionally have some salmon or whitefish or something like that. Obviously, it's probably a little better for you if you get it grilled versus fried or something like that too. But these fatty acids are really good for you. They're pivotal in your membranes. They actually help with the consistency of your heartbeat. So they help avoid what's called an arrhythmia. They appear to really help with brain health. In fact, increasing omega-3 lipids has been suggested as a possible way to avoid things like Alzheimer's disease or Parkinson's disease of the brain, is to have more of these omega-3 fatty acids in your diet. And then the maybe most important thing of all is these tend not to cause weight gain or vascular problems. Again, people associate fat with, that's bad and it's going to make me heavier. But what we've shown is that these omega-3 oils are actually really good for you and don't tend to cause weight gain or those sort of things. Now, the clinical application that we want to look at when it comes to lipids has to do with cholesterol. So here's a really big mouthful, right? Hypercholesterolemia. But what this means is high cholesterol. Now, after high blood pressure, high cholesterol is one of the most commonly diagnosed conditions in American adults. And it has a lot to do with our diets. Your body makes enough cholesterol completely on its own. So in other words, you don't need any dietary intake of cholesterol. And yet a lot of foods have this. Some foods, like things like red meat, bacon, eggs, the egg yolk part, these are natural sources of cholesterol. And you really don't need any of that in your body, or in your diet, because your body actually creates cholesterol. Kind of like you can think of it as almost any fat that you eat, your body can convert into cholesterol, which has a unique shape over here in this picture. But if it converts it into cholesterol, it is doing that to help with cellular functions. Kind of two things, really. Cholesterol is really important for your membranes, and cholesterol is really important in hormone production. So some of your hormones are actually derived from cholesterol. But again, your body makes what it needs. You don't need to eat any cholesterol at all. And the reality is that a lot of people have a bad diet or a poor diet, and it includes quite a bit of cholesterol. Now, the reason this becomes a really big concern, all right? So in your bloodstream, right, you carry around cholesterol as a lipoprotein, which means it's sort of part fat and part protein, right, moving around in your bloodstream. Now, it shows up in a couple different forms that you maybe have heard of before. The first one is HDL, which stands for high density lipoprotein. And the second one is called LDL, which stands for low density lipoprotein. Now, you maybe have heard of good cholesterol and bad cholesterol before. HDL is referred to as good cholesterol, and LDL is referred to as bad cholesterol. Now, those are slightly misnomers, but really what it comes down to is HDL is the type of cholesterol that your body manufactures to use in your membranes and in your hormones. LDL tends to increase when you have too high of dietary fat content. So if you've got too much fat in your diet, you end up with higher LDL numbers, and that's why we tend to call this bad cholesterol. Now, if your cholesterol is too high, you have a problem, right? So if cholesterol in your blood stays elevated, upwards arrows here, what happens is called atherosclerosis. And sclerosis just means hardening. And so what we're talking about is this process in this picture. Normally, cholesterol moves around your bloodstream, and that's okay. You should have some of it there. But if levels get too high, some of that cholesterol starts to get deposited in the lining of your blood vessels. Now, when this happens, notice in this picture, it's building up inside the blood vessel wall. And what happens is it forms this plaque, which hardens the vessel and also narrows the opening that you have in that vessel. Now, what are some things that can happen? Well, because of this narrowing, you can end up with blood clots that form in that narrowed vessel. And blood clots can sort of take flight, right, and move to your heart, which would be called a heart attack, right, or move to your brain, which would be what we call a stroke, right, or there's just other cardiovascular issues that we worry about. Now, some people have higher genetic amounts of cholesterol. So a lot of times we would diagnose someone with hypercholesterolemia, and it's actually hereditary. It's actually genetic. And that includes me. When I was in college, I was in probably the best shape of my life, certainly better shape than I'm in now. And yet I went to the doctor. I had never had my cholesterol tested before, and we did that when I was 20 years old, and my cholesterol was through the roof. And I actually didn't eat that bad. I was in college, but my diet was not too bad either, and I was exercising all the time, and yet my cholesterol was bad. And so to this day, I actually take medicine for it. And a lot of times, again, I'm not in as good a shape as I should be, and my diet isn't as good as it should be. But for some people, they have high cholesterol even though they're in really good shape, and you would look at them and not think, hey, this person's overweight, this person probably has these issues, but still you see these issues. So what are the diagnostics? I'm going to switch to green here. So what do we look for, right? What we hope to see, so I'm going to put DX here for diagnostics, so let's say what should you have? So we should see total cholesterol, which would be, HDL plus LDL, we want to see as less than 200, and that's milligrams per deciliter, but don't worry about the units. So we want to see total cholesterol under 200. We also want to see an HDL greater than 60 and an LDL less than 100. All right, so let's say that again. So when we look at someone's cholesterol, what we should see, what we hope to see, is that they have less than 200 for their total cholesterol. And that then when we break down that number, we want to see HDL over 60. So we actually want to see that good cholesterol a little higher. And LDL we want to see under 100. So what we often talk about here is the ratio of HDL to LDL. So not only do we want to see a healthy total, but we also want to see a healthy ratio of HDL to LDL. So if you have a patient whose cholesterol is over 200, you probably want to offer them some sort of treatment. So let's change colors one more time. I'm running out of space here, and talk about treatment. The most common treatment, well, let's start with the first thing we should have is a lifestyle change. Right, so the first thing that we always want to offer people is diet and exercise. But sometimes that won't work. So what we look at instead are called statin drugs. Most likely you guys have heard of Lipitor or Crestor is on TV quite a bit. These are name brands for statin drugs. And what statins do is they lower body production of cholesterol. So a statin drug goes in, and hopefully your patient is also eating better and not eating that much cholesterol. But then the statin drug goes in like Crestor, and it causes the body to generate a little less cholesterol as well. And so hopefully the combination of a better diet and the statin drug will reduce that patient's cholesterol levels. All right, so a couple other little nutritional pieces real quick, and we really will move quickly through these. First, a lot of times I feel like people don't know what vitamins and minerals are for. They know they should have vitamins and minerals. They probably took a vitamin like these Flintstone vitamins when they were a little kid, but they don't really know what the point of them is, right? So a vitamin is an organic compound, meaning it's made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. But it's not a lipid, it's not a protein, it's not a carbohydrate. So it generally does not give you energy, right? It doesn't give you calories. But instead, it aids your metabolism. The way that I would say it here is that it helps enzymes. So all the different vitamins that you might get, A, C, D, the different types of B vitamins, all of these vitamins primarily assist your enzymes. They help enzymes to help reactions. Now, without the vitamin, the enzymes don't work as well. And so if you don't have a vitamin, you can end up with a deficiency disease. Right? There are a lot of these, some of which you maybe have heard of before. Just to give us one example, we've got something called scurvy. It's not just for pirates, if you've ever heard that, them use that term in some sort of TV show or something. But scurvy is a deficiency of vitamin C. And what this does is a lot of different stuff, actually. It causes weakness. It causes the tissues to actually bleed just a little bit. So you usually get these weird sort of bruise-looking spots on the body. Actually causes bleeding from the gums as well, and tooth loss. Causes all sorts of issues with your immune system, so you tend to get infections more easily. And then it also hurts your ability to heal from injury. And then ultimately, if you are really vitamin C deficient, it can cause death. So it is a concern if somebody doesn't have a good diet. And while a lot of people, including myself, you take a multivitamin each day, it's the easiest way to get vitamins is fruits and vegetables. I had a professor one time that just said if it's a colorful food, it probably is good for you in terms of vitamins. So all those fruits and vegetables out there are really good for vitamins. Second thing is minerals. Now, minerals, as you might guess, if you kind of have a chemistry type brain, these are not organic. These are inorganic things. So other things on the periodic table that still function somehow in your body. And what scientists have suggested is that the minerals we need are minerals that were probably really prevalent in our environment when humans were generated, whenever that was. But minerals also have to be part of your diet, and they can do all sorts of stuff. This is a little periodic table where the elements are circled that are important for your body. Obviously, some of these are structural things like carbon, but then all these other ones that you may not have expected, some of the metals and things, are also important in your body. Iodine is a good example, and kind of a random function here, but iodine is essential in your thyroid. Basically, you can't make thyroid hormones without iodine. That's the only function they have in the body, but that's what they're there for. And so without them, you have a problem. Iron, right? The metal. Iron is important in hemoglobin. Basically, you can't move oxygen in your bloodstream without some iron. And that's also why your blood has sort of a metallic taste or a metallic smell to it, is because of the iron content that's in there. Now, we're not going to go on too long here in terms of nutrition and dieting, but I do want to just give you a glimpse of what a nutritionist specializes in and what they say about the diet. There's really kind of two rules that I would urge you to keep in mind. The first one, and the big number one rule, is today they say that your diet should be all things in moderation. So that means you do want all the different sources like carbs, lipids, and proteins, but you just don't want too much of any of them. Right? That's what moderation means. Now, the FDA also recommends what is referred to as a healthy eating pattern. And this kind of means two things, right? This means, consistency, but it also means regularity. So you want to eat all things in moderation, and you want to do it with a healthy pattern, meaning that you do regularly eat, like breakfast, lunch, dinner. People who skip meals actually tend to be less well nourished, not just because they're eating less, but because it sort of throws off their entire metabolism. So if we look at the USDA current guidelines that they have out there, they tell you that you should have a variety of carbs, lipids, and proteins, so fruits and vegetables, grains, oils. They do urge us to limit saturated fat, so less than 10% of your daily calories should be saturated. They urge us to limit trans fat completely, right? They urge us to eat less than 10% of our daily calories from added sugars, which would be things like sweets, right, versus the sugars we would get in grains or fruits or vegetables. And they also encourage us to have less than 2,300 milligrams of sodium a day. Too much salt does a lot of stuff to you, but it definitely affects your bloodstream, your blood pressure, and those sort of things. And so that's also a piece to dietary guidelines. Now, fad diets, which I do believe we cover in our health classes here at Mercy, fad diets are not great. A lot of people, a lot of adults jump into fad diets like the Atkins diet, the keto diet, the paleo diet, the list can go on. And the reality is that none of these are very good for you because most of them encourage you to remove an entire food group almost completely. So like the Atkins diet wants you to limit or eliminate carbs, and that really isn't healthy in the long term. The other big thing, and this is what I always tell people if anybody ever asks me, is that these fad diets just aren't very realistic, right? The idea that you can cut out carbs completely for the rest of your life and maintain that is not good. One, it's not healthy to do that, but two, it's just not very realistic that someone can do that. Yeah, maybe for a couple months you can stand to avoid desserts or whatever, but eventually you're going to hit that again. And so those types of diet are just sometimes dangerous, but the biggest thing is that they're not very realistic because they're very hard to maintain over a long period of time. Whereas if you can just get used to eating right, not eating in excess, not eating too much of any one thing, then you can maintain a healthy diet and a healthy lifestyle in that way a lot easier. We're not going to go through this. You can check this out. But biggest thing here is more the bottom of this slide that I want to point out. So the USDA recommends that the average adult female consume about 2,000 calories a day. For you guys, your age bracket, you would actually still be a little, encouraged to eat a little bit more than 2,000 calories per day because you guys are still growing and developing. And then the average adult male, they recommend 2,500 calories a day. And that's usually because male's got a little bit more mass to him. So, basically this number of calories will maintain weight in a male, while a female at about 2,000 calories will maintain weight. But this also depends on age. It depends on activity level. If you've got a friend who likes to do Ironman competitions, she will probably need to ingest a few more calories a day because of how much she's burning in her training versus somebody like Mr. Burden who doesn't work out all that much at all. Now, there's, suggestions they have for how much of each thing you get, but by no means do you need to know those as we move forward. And then I just thought these were kind of interesting, these breakdowns of the body. So notice the body's about 60% water, and then after that, about 17% lipids. And then if we look at the tissue breakdown, your body's about 40% muscle, or your mass should be about 40% muscle is what we look at. So last thing here is the question of, okay, what happens when we actually eat these different calorie sources? So first, carbohydrates. When you eat carbohydrates, it's going to cause an almost immediate blood sugar increase, right? You're going to digest those carbs in your gut, absorb them into your blood as glucose. And this increased blood sugar actually leads to drowsiness. So, time to refute one of the biggest myths in the world, right? That myth is that Thanksgiving turkey makes you sleepy. Now, everybody knows this. I could ask it if we were in class and most of you would respond. The myth is that you get this tryptophan amino acid in turkey and it makes you sleepy. Now, the reality is that yes, tryptophan in large amounts can make you sleepy. So they're not lying to you. But think for a moment about Thanksgiving. Right? Yeah, you probably eat some turkey. But then all of the different side items that people tend to consume on Thanksgiving are all carbs. Right? Mashed potatoes, macaroni and cheese, stuffing, cranberry stuff, whatever that is, sweet potatoes, other vegetables, right? So when you eat all those carbs at Thanksgiving, that's why you feel sleepy and you need a nap. So this year at Thanksgiving, when your annoying Uncle Randy is all like, well, you know why you're sleepy? It's turkey. Tell him, no, you're wrong, Randy. It's because of all those carbs we just ate instead. Now, when you break down those carbs into glucose, then you can absorb the glucose to your tissues, and you break that glucose down in cellular respiration. And that's going to give you, cellular energy. Now, as we kind of talked about when we talked about the pancreas, insulin is released. It helps your bodies absorb those sugar molecules. And a lot of times, if you don't use those right away, you're going to store them as glycogen sort of temporarily. All right, so that's temporary storage until we use them a little bit later when it's been a while since we ate. Now, if you have excess carbs Or you do like Mr. Burton does and you eat something sweet right before you go to bed and you don't use those carbs at all for a while. What does happen is conversion to long-term storage, which is called lipogenesis. So basically, if you take those carbs and you don't use them, they turn into fat, and that gets stored in your body. And so this is why it's not a good idea to eat cake at midnight and then go to bed, because the majority of that glucose is about to be stored as fat in your body. How about protein? All right, so protein's interesting. In grown-ups, you need protein, right, in your diet, but you end up excreting a lot of that protein back out because while you're going to use some protein to maintain your body, you're not growing, right? You're not getting any bigger as an adult or anything like that. And so what tends to happen is you have this balance of protein, and we call it a nitrogen balance since protein is the nitrogen source in your body. So most adults, and actually you guys are getting close to this point as well at your age, are in a state of nitrogen balance, which means you pretty much take in and excrete a roughly equal amount. Now, little kids are different, right? Little kids are growing and developing. So most of the protein that they eat is actually going to get used and incorporated into their body, and you're going to see less amino acid excretion. So we say that little kids are in negative nitrogen balance, but that's a good thing, right? So that's good for them. That means that the protein they're eating is actually being used to build muscle, help develop their bones, and all those sort of things. Now, again, any of the 8 essential amino acids are used for structure in your body, and then other amino acids will generally be used in cellular respiration. So they'll also be used for cellular energy. And again, if there's an excess of these things, then they will be stored either as proteins or potentially as fats as well. So again, no excess, right? We want to eat in moderation. Last thing are lipids. So here's a donut burger from the fair. It's not mine personally. I just got this picture off the internet. But, when we eat lipids, we do a weird thing. Our body actually breaks them down and then rebuilds them almost exactly as they were ingested. But now sort of they're your own or something. I don't really know why the body does this. But most of those are going to be stored for energy. Some lipids can be used in cellular respiration, so sometimes, there goes the dog. Sometimes they can be used for cellular energy, but for the most part, again, these lipids are just going to be stored in your body. Really excess fats you might convert into cholesterol, which again, kind of worst case is that these actually go to the blood vessel walls. And so again, this can cause, atherosclerosis. This is basically like atherosclerosis right here wrapped in plastic. Now, when you have excess fats, your liver will first convert them into what are called ketones or ketone bodies. And this is not necessarily a bad thing, okay? So this is not bad. Ketone bodies can be used for energy later on. And so all of us, after we eat every once in a while, we're going to eat some things that are kind of fattier, and we'll generate some ketone bodies, and that's not too bad of a thing. However, if this happens a lot, and if this happens in excess, we can get what's called ketosis, which means a really increased level of these ketones in your blood. And ketones in your blood will actually lower the pH, which means your blood gets a little bit acidic. We call this ketoacidosis. And ketoacidosis can cause kidney failure, among other kind of organ issues and organ shutdowns, and can potentially be fatal. So, again, we're talking about some pretty extreme obesity and some issues there, but it's possible for this to become a really serious condition if there's way too much fat consistently in the diet. All right, so that wraps things up, but it leads us right to our next unit, which will ask the question, what happens next? Right? So we ingest all these biomolecules and these calories, but at this point we've just kind of said, yeah, and then we'll use them to give us cellular energy. So the next unit is all about how you use energy at that cellular level. And I'll be honest, it's a little bit complicated, so that's what we're moving into next. Now, real quick, before I let you go, I know this has been way long enough, but I did forget to include one thing the other day when we talked about diabetes, and that was the diagnostic info for that. So in other words, how do we test for diabetes? I don't know how I left this out, but I think I did. I'm almost positive that I did when we covered this in class. So the way we test for this, right, is that we look at blood glucose levels, right? And this is how it works. So we would diagnose someone as diabetic if, the first thing, they had 2 consecutive fasting glucose over 126 milligrams per deciliter. So that would mean, you would be fasting, so you wouldn't have eaten for a while. They take your blood, your glucose is over 126. So they would kind of put a watch on it, right? Ask you to come back sometime in the near future and have the same test done again. And if it comes back over 126 again, then they would say, okay, you have diabetes. Now, second option, right? So it's kind of like, or you have 1 random glucose. So like any time, doesn't have to be fasting, that is over 200 milligrams per deciliter. So at no point, even right after you eat, should the blood sugar really be over 200. And so if somebody comes into your office and you test their blood and they have a glucose over 200, that's indicative of diabetes as well. Or, particularly on TV commercials, you guys have maybe heard of an A1C. Right? A1C is a little complicated. A1C looks at sugar that's attached to hemoglobin in your blood, which really takes a while for that to happen. So a lot of doctors would tell you the A1C test is the better test for diabetes because it gives you more of like a long-term, like a couple month picture of someone's blood sugar. But if someone has an A1C greater than 6.5%, that's indicative of diabetes. Anything under 6.5%, and you're really not too worried, but if it gets above that, it becomes sort of a concern. And so those are the 3 possible ways to do blood tests for diabetes that I meant to talk about that day in class, but I want to make sure that you know those because these will help you be able to tell if someone has diabetes, say as a case study on our upcoming tests. So I know this was long. Thanks for sticking with me, and I will see you guys in class.